One.
Good evening. This is Vicki Partlow for EDL 853 Module 8 case study. Get this child out of my room. Carl Hughes is a third grade student who has been identified as having an emotional disability. Carl currently lives in the home of his mother, older brother, and sister. His father has joint custody. However, his parents divorced about 3 months ago. Carl has an individual education program that was reviewed at the beginning of the school year. And at the time, the team had decided to continue using the behavior management plan that had been working in the classroom. It was a consequence reward system, and they had had some success with that. However, Miss Taylor, his general education teacher, reported that Carl's self-abusive behaviors have escalated to be physically threatening to both the teacher and his classmates. Category 1, problem identification analysis. We ask, what do we know? We know that there is a change in Carl's behavior after the divorce. We also know that the special education teacher, Susan Green, is new and she has just graduated. And she took the place of a veteran teacher who had been at the school for a very long time. We know that the relationship between Carl's parents is very hostile. We saw that in the case study where the parents had finally come in for a meeting, and basically Mrs. Hughes broke down and cried and pretty much was screaming at the father about how he doesn't help out or take the kids anymore. We know that Carl is identified as a student with an emotional disability, and that his current intervention on his behavior management plan is a consequence reward system. We also know that, according to his teacher, his current plan is not working. He does not care whether he gets a reward or a consequence for his behavior. And we also find out that Miss Taylor is not really on board with having a new intervention plan. She would prefer that Carl be taken out of her classroom. What we need to know overall is that what are Carl's current goals and objectives, as well as his service plan times? Has the team initiated a functional behavior assessment? That's very important to know. Was the data that was gathered to create the initial behavior management plan based on a functional behavioral assessment? So we need to know that information. We also need to know whether or not Carl has talked to the school counselor, the school psychologist, or even if his parents have initiated any outside counseling for Carl and his siblings. We also should know how often was the former special education teacher removing students from the classroom due to behavioral issues. You know, she'd been there a long time, and this is what teachers are familiar with, so they might not understand what an inclusive classroom means. Have any other interventions been introduced or utilized in helping Carl manage his behavior? And we also would need to know, what is the current caseload of Miss Green? Does she have time in her caseload that she can spend with Carl one-on-one? Is there a special education paraprofessional that can be utilized to work with Carl? And most importantly, we need to know, is there any kind of emotional and physical abuse in the home? We might not know this information ever, but Carl has been identified as a child with an emotional disability because he had self-injurious behaviors. And so what we would need to know is maybe what caused him to start having those kinds of self-injurious behaviors. So when looking at the overall case study, it seems that the problem that we need to identify is that Carl is angry. He struggles with regulating his behavior. And, this has escalated to the point where he's lashing out at others, probably due from frustration and hurt and pain. As we know, his mother is not home very often. She has to work. So he's probably being watched by his two older siblings. We also know that the father has joint custody, but he's not spending much time with Carl anymore. So, overall, Carl doesn't appear to have good role models at home that can help him or for him to even model his behavior on. And what's really sad is that he doesn't seem to have the support of his teacher. She doesn't appear to want to help Carl deal with these strong emotions that he has, and she prefers that he just be removed from her classroom. So, in order to work with Carl, I proposed a plan of action. The first step, of course, is always to call the team together, the general education teacher, the special education teacher, as well as, any other people that are working with Carl or who could possibly work with Carl, such as the school counselor, social worker, and school psychologist. Step two is definitely to initiate a functional behavioral assessment. We need to determine what are the target behaviors that we want to eliminate. We need to answer the questions like, what is Carl doing that hinders his or her classmates' educational performance? We need to discuss as a team those interventions that we've tried with Carl and determine their success and failure. And we also need to decide who will be responsible for certain aspects of the FBA, such as ABC charts, frequency charts, motivational assessments, parent-teacher interviews, and classroom observations. Motivation assessments are very important to see what kinds of things the child will respond to positively. And those parent interviews are very helpful in looking at the social, emotional history of a child. Step three would be to reconvene the team within 2 to 3 weeks to analyze the data collected and kind of formulate a hypothesis. In the meantime, on step four, while the team is working through the FBA process, we need to continue the intervention that was proposed at the last meeting, where Carl would work with the special education teacher in the resource room when he was having difficulty regulating his behavior in the general education classroom. Some strategies that can be implemented during this time are things such as designating an area in the general education classroom as a calm down spot so that Carl or any other student can use it to kind of control strong feelings or to kind of get away from things and decompress and have an area where they can feel safe to let out some of those feelings of frustration and anger. When Carl is pulled out of the classroom to go to the resource room, it might help him to go to the gym or outside for 5 to 10 minutes to work through some of those emotions by, the use of what we call heavy work, pushing, pulling, jumping, climbing, running, playing, doing things that kind of work those muscles, and it kind of helps get out some of that frustration. Allow Carl to have what we call a take a break by giving him a pass so that he can get a drink of water or go to the restroom or even run an errand for the teacher when it looks like he's starting to rev up and that he needs something to help him kind of redirect his focus and his behavior. Step 5, when the team reconvenes, let's determine what kind of positive behavioral supports, environmental supports, and interventions that will be utilized. In step 6, we need to determine reinforcers, things that Carl is very motivated to work for. And step 5, implementing that behavior intervention plan. The nice thing about a behavioral intervention plan is that it needs people to come back to it and review it every so often so that it remains current and appropriate for Carl in its present state. My rationale behind this proposed plan of action is that it's apparent that Carl's needs have intensified to the point that he can no longer access the learning environment. The reward system that he had is not working for him any longer. And although it's stated in the case study that there does not appear to be, quote, a clear pattern, end quote, that precipitates Carl's aggressive behavior, it is very important to collect data both directly and indirectly to kind of get a full picture of the function of Carl's behavior. And by working through this formal process, the team will have opportunities to meet and discuss interventions and strategies that can be utilized, tried, and determined to be effective or not effective for Carl. When we talk about promoting the success of all students, what is best for all students? Well, first of all, a behavior intervention plan will help guide decisions for Carl that will directly impact his classmates and overall classroom environment. So through this plan, we'll be promoting positive interventions that look at possibly modifying the physical environment for him, adjusting the curriculum or instructional strategy so that he can access learning. You need to possibly change the reasons and consequences of his behavior. And then we also need to teach Carl a more acceptable replacement behavior. Secondly, as an educational leader, I should make it a point to put an appearance into Miss Taylor's classroom on the days that I'm in the district. This emphasizes the importance to Miss Taylor that Carl is her student and she is responsible for implementing the plan and following through with the interventions and strategies the team has created. Thirdly, seeking out professional development and training in class management systems such as responsive classroom or conscious discipline should be provided to the entire district at the beginning of the school year. By providing teachers with a structured framework for classroom management, it benefits the entire class and not just those students who are struggling with behavior. And fourth, as an educational leader, it might be beneficial to discuss with school leaders a plan to initiate a response to intervention process to apply to children who are struggling with their emotions and are acting out in the school setting. We do have a three-tiered approach in our district that looks at what interventions at tier 1 would be appropriate for working with children who have some behavioral challenges. And then, we work through to tier 2 interventions, working more in an individual capacity with those children. And if we have to move on to those more intense instructional and behavioral interventions for students at tier 3, usually by this point we're initiating a functional behavioral assessment. Reflecting back on the case study, case studies provide students opportunities to work through situations they might confront later on in their chosen fields, things that, maybe as a classroom teacher, you look at a little bit differently than as an instructional leader. This case is a particularly difficult case, but unfortunately it's one that we see quite frequently in our district. We regularly have team meetings for students with behavioral needs, and we implement a wide variety of strategies and interventions to help the student in the classroom as a team. And that team typically includes, the classroom teacher, counselors. We have our school psychologist and our educational diagnostician as part of those meetings. Many of these students are not necessarily special education students. And like I said before, we have a tiered intervention program that we work through before implementing an FBA. Some of the issues, I believe Carl will continue to have issues throughout his academic career, mainly because he's not receiving the support he needs in his home environment. There's little stability in his home, absent parents, siblings with their own emotional difficulties. So Carl's only hope is that the school helps him learn to regulate strong emotions and provide him with the support and attention that he's desperately seeking. Carl also needs a teacher who does not feel that removal from the general education classroom is the answer to helping Carl with his emotional regulation. So by providing support to the general education teacher through the use of positive interventions, the possibility of the special education teacher or paraprofessional in the classroom to help collaborate with Ms. Taylor, we hope, she begins to see the value of keeping Carl in the general education setting as much as possible. And, Carl has been receiving services for self-abusive behavior prior to the onset of this destructive and threatening behavior he's now exhibiting. However, we're still unaware if there's any kind of form of abuse or neglect occurring in the home. in reality, why was he exhibiting self-abusive behavior to begin with? And this is a kind of an important thing for the team to kind of seek out through the social worker to have some answers to Carl's previous social developmental history. In regards to promoting the academic success of every student, as an educational leader, I will, adding additional help to Miss Taylor's classroom will allow her to focus on teaching rather than always managing Carl's behavior. Exploring classroom management systems for the district in order for teachers not to rely on removing students from their classroom in order to maintain order and control, giving them the training to understand how to do that. Also have training on inclusive classrooms and special education so that teachers understand that removal of students is not the only solution for students with challenging behaviors or difficulties of any kind. And in promoting the personal well-being of every student, as an educational leader, I will facilitate professional development opportunities for the educational staff to learn about social emotional learning programs such as conscious discipline. Have Carl see the school social worker to help him work through his anger and frustration. I would encourage the parents to also work with a social worker to kind of help rebuild a positive family structure of love and support for Carl and his siblings. Encourage the school counselor to provide social opportunities for Carl and other students, such as a lunch bunch group that will focus on topics such as anger management, appropriate interaction with peers, and how to cope with situations in the home setting. And under component 3, enhance instructional capacity, as an educational leader, I will allow opportunities for teachers to work together and collaborate so they can increase student achievement through shared ideas and activities. Also providing opportunities for teachers, especially Ms. Taylor, to observe other classrooms. We call these learning walks, and see how communication and collaboration and student engagement is happening among students and how other teachers handle situations who also have behavioral needs and concerns. And also to provide time for staff working with Carl to come together weekly to discuss how things are going in the classroom. This will allow for the staff to review those interventions and determine if they're working or not.